I used to believe silence was harmless, that it meant rest, or peace, or the simple comfort of a shared room. But on the night everything changed, silence felt like a presence watching me, waiting for me to notice what I had tried so hard to ignore. It was exactly midnight when it began, the red digits on the clock glowing like a warning I hadn't yet learned how to read. Ryan lay beside me, his back turned in a posture that had become all too familiar. A year ago, we fell asleep tangled together, his arm draped over my waist, his breath warm against my neck. Now his distance felt like a cold wall I woke up to every morning. Sometimes I tried convincing myself that work stress was wearing him down, that his shrinking warmth had nothing to do with us. But deep inside, I knew better. I could feel the shift the way you sense winter coming long before the first snowfall. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, when I heard it, soft, breath-like, almost fragile. Emily. My name. Whispered. Not dreamlike, not imagined, not a fragment of memory. Real. Too real. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, shaped only by thin moonlight slipping through the curtains. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened for footsteps, movement, anything. But there was only stillness. I turned slightly, watching Ryan's silhouette. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, perfectly timed, almost rehearsed. Something about it made my stomach twist. It wasn't the breathing of someone lost in sleep. It was controlled, deliberate. Ryan. My voice came out small, cautious. No response. But then his hand shifted, just a twitch beneath the blanket. Enough to tell me he wasn't asleep at all. Enough to confirm that whisper hadn't been a slip of a dream. I stared at him, at the broad line of his back, at the distance he had built so carefully. A pulse of dread ran through me. Why was he whispering my name if he wasn't asleep? And why did it sound like he wasn't whispering to me at all? The thought landed in my chest with a weight so heavy I felt breathless. I remembered the recent weeks, his phone always face down, the late-night messages he brushed off as work updates, the way he flinched when I reached for him as if affection had become a burden. The whisper connected everything. It was the first sound of a truth that had been silently forming behind my back. I didn't move. I didn't question him again. I let the darkness settle around us like a curtain closing on a scene I wasn't ready to witness. But I knew, in that exact moment, the life I thought I understood was beginning to crack. And whatever waited on the other side of that crack was coming for me. Morning light has a way of making everything look softer than it feels. When I woke up, Ryan was already in the kitchen, moving with that familiar mechanical efficiency he used whenever he wanted to appear normal. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee like a man following choreography rather than instinct. "Morning," he said without looking at me. His voice was gentle, but gentleness can sometimes feel like a performance. I studied the stiff line of his shoulders, the way he kept his eyes on the mug instead of my face. It struck me that emotional distance doesn't announce itself with dramatic arguments, it settles slowly, like dust on forgotten furniture. I sat across from him, the quiet between us stretching thin. I wanted to confront him about the whisper, about the phone I saw glowing beneath the covers last week, about the way he had started guarding parts of himself from me. But confrontation requires certainty, and I had nothing but a handful of unsettling moments and a heart that wouldn't stop clenching. We had been together for almost 4 years. Long enough for me to memorize the map of his emotions. Long enough to notice when something subtle but vital had shifted inside him. Ryan wasn't cruel, or reckless, or careless. At least, not before. He was steady, thoughtful, the kind of man who used to listen with his entire body, shoulders angled toward me, fingers tapping lightly whenever he was anxious. Time changes people, yes, but love isn't supposed to vanish quietly. Maybe that's what scared me most, the silence. As he slid a cup toward me, his hand brushed mine. A simple touch. But the shock of unfamiliarity jolted through me. This was the same man who once held my face in his palms like it was the most important thing he'd ever touched. Now even accidental contact felt foreign. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question sounded sincere, but something in his eyes flickered: guilt, tension, hesitation. A mix of emotions he tried desperately to hide. "I'm fine," I lied, watching him too closely. His gaze dropped to his phone on the table. Face down, always face down. A small gesture, yet loud enough to echo through every insecure corner of my mind. He cleared his throat and grabbed his keys. "Work's going to be hectic today," he said. "I might be late." Another line in a script he had been repeating more frequently. I nodded, though my chest tightened. "Okay." He hesitated for a second, like he wanted to say something meaningful, but didn't. Instead, he kissed the top of my head, a touch so weightless it barely counted as affection, and walked out the door. The apartment fell silent again. And the whisper from the night before returned to me not as sound, but as a warning. Something was wrong. And whatever it was, Ryan wasn't ready to face it. But I was. Emily spent the next morning trying to convince herself that the whispered voice had been nothing more than a dream stitched from exhaustion. Yet the memory clung to her like a cold shadow, replaying in her mind with unnerving clarity. Every syllable Emily felt too precise to dismiss. She moved through her apartment with restless energy, tracing familiar spaces as if seeing them for the first time. The living room felt tighter. The hallway seemed longer. Even the soft glow of morning light brought no comfort. It was as though the entire place had shifted an inch to the left, almost imperceptible but undeniably wrong. Still, she forced herself into routine. Coffee. Emails. A half-hearted attempt at breakfast. But beneath each action ran the same quiet tension, a fragile thread pulling her back to the moment when her name was spoken in a room where she stood alone. By noon, Emily gave in and called her best friend, Sarah. She didn't expect answers, just the reassurance of another voice. But even as she tried to explain the whisper, her words fell apart, sounding childish, exaggerated, unreal. Sarah laughed softly, saying it was probably stress, urging her to get more sleep, promising to come over later in the week. When the call ended, Emily wished she hadn't made it. Sarah's casual dismissal only sharpened her unease. Hours passed. She worked, paced, reread messages she didn't remember sending, and tried to calm the strange flutter in her pulse. The whisper had not returned, but silence somehow felt louder, pressing against her ears with a quiet insistence. As evening arrived, Emily walked to her bedroom doorway and froze. Her blanket, left messy and tossed aside that morning, was now neatly folded at the foot of the bed. Perfectly straight. Not a wrinkle. Her breath hitched. She lived alone. No one had come in. The windows were locked. She checked the door twice every night. And she knew she hadn't touched the blanket. For a long moment, she simply stared, the hairs on her arms lifting one by one. Her mind scrambled for logic. Maybe she had folded it and forgotten. Maybe she'd done it automatically. Maybe she was more tired than she realized. But the truth settled like a stone in her chest. She didn't forget things like that. Ever. Emily stepped back, heart thundering. The apartment was no longer a silent comfort, it was a watching presence, waiting for her to notice the next wrong thing. She closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. Yet even with the door shut, she felt it, the unmistakable instinct that someone had been in her room. And that they could still be here. The whisper suddenly seemed far less like a dream, and far more like the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. But the night was coming again. And Emily wasn't sure she would be alone when it arrived. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The apartment was too quiet, too precise, as though it were holding its breath. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whisper still ringing in her mind, each repetition sharper than the last. Emily. Emily. It was impossible to shake, impossible to ignore. Her thoughts kept returning to Ryan. The way he had been distant, the way his phone always stayed face down, the subtle tension that had become impossible to overlook. She hadn't wanted to admit it, not to herself, but a small, gnawing suspicion had been growing for weeks. And now, after the whisper, it had exploded into full awareness. Something was wrong. Something profound, something deliberate. Unable to remain still, she rose and padded silently to the living room. The dim light from the street filtered through the blinds, casting slattered shadows across the floor. Her eyes fell on Ryan's laptop left open on the dining table. He had forgotten it this time. Curiosity warred with fear, but she couldn't stop herself. The screen glowed faintly, already signed into his email. Her fingers hovered for a moment, trembling, before she clicked through the messages. And there it was, a thread she shouldn't have seen, words that pierced her chest like needles. Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you more every day. Me too. Thinking about you is driving me crazy. Promise me no one will find out. Emily felt the room tilt, the shadows spinning around her. She sank onto the edge of the couch, hands pressed against her face, trying to block the sting of betrayal that hit harder than she could have imagined. Ryan's infidelity was no longer a suspicion, no longer a question of maybe. It was absolute. Concrete. Irrefutable. Her mind raced. Questions tumbled over one another. How long? How often? Who? Why? And the cruelest, loudest one. Did he ever really love me? She heard the faint click of keys from the other room. Ryan was home. He had returned from work late, silent as always. He didn't know she had seen the messages. Part of her wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers, to scream until her voice broke. But another part, the part that loved him despite everything, hesitated. The ache in her chest was heavy, suffocating. She realized the whisper at midnight wasn't just a phantom or a dream. It had been a warning, a signal of the cracks she had refused to see. And now the truth was here, raw and undeniable. Emily rose slowly, trying to steady herself. She could hear Ryan's movements in the bedroom, soft and unknowing. Every step he took felt like a betrayal echoing through the apartment. Her hands shook, but her resolve hardened. She didn't know what would happen next. Confrontation? Escape? Forgiveness? None of it mattered yet. Right now, she only knew one thing. Her world had changed, and she could no longer pretend. And as the city lights flickered through the blinds, Emily realized with a terrifying clarity that the night was far from over, and neither was the reckoning that awaited her. Morning came slowly, a pale grey light seeping through the blinds. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee, staring at the floor as if it held answers. Ryan had left earlier, quiet, trying to act normal, but she knew he hadn't slept. Neither had she. The messages, the whisper, the betrayal, they all hovered in the room like ghosts she could not chase away. Her chest ached with the weight of understanding that love alone sometimes isn't enough. That people, even the ones you trust most, are capable of choices that fracture your world in silence. She remembered the first nights with Ryan, the laughter, the way his hand fit perfectly in hers, the careless tenderness that had made her believe they could withstand anything. And now, those memories felt fragile, like glass she could no longer touch without fear. Emily rose and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. She could see the city below, indifferent and endless, and she realized how small her personal heartbreak felt in the scope of the world, but still, it was her world, and it was breaking. She didn't know if she would forgive Ryan. Perhaps she would, someday. Or perhaps she would choose to let him go entirely. What mattered now was the quiet strength rising inside her, a determination to reclaim her own sense of worth, her own sense of self. She had been too gentle, too willing to ignore the warning signs. Not anymore. The whisper that had once seemed a frightening anomaly had transformed into clarity. It had awakened her to truths she had been too afraid to face, that love must be mutual, that intimacy cannot survive on secrets, that betrayal, emotional or otherwise, demands confrontation. Her phone buzzed, a message from Ryan, simple and hesitant. "Can we talk?" She stared at it, feeling the old affection battling with new resolve. She could respond. She could ignore. She could decide what she deserved without letting anyone else dictate her boundaries. Emily set the mug down and exhaled slowly. The apartment, once a space of whispered shadows, now felt like a testing ground for her own strength. She would speak to him when she was ready, on her terms. Not tonight. Not yet. But she would. And as she looked out at the waking city, a quiet determination settled over her. The heartbreak didn't vanish, and the betrayal didn't erase itself, but Emily understood one vital truth: survival isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing yourself even when your heart still reaches for someone else. The whisper of midnight would linger in her memory forever, not as terror, but as awakening. She was no longer just reacting to the cracks in her life. She was stepping forward, aware, cautious, and unshakably herself. And with that, Emily took her first deliberate breath of freedom.